Welcome back to the channel. This is Chris Morris, and in today's video, I want to continue our conversation of the problem of evil. We've been discussing this extensively, so check the link in the description below for the playlist of the background videos we've done. Here we have laid out the traditional form what the problem of evil is. If God is all-powerful, then he can stop evil. If he's all-knowing, he knows how to stop evil. If he's all good, then he wants to stop evil, and yet there is evil. And so somehow this seems to imply it is argued that therefore God is not all powerful, not all knowing, or not all good. One of the primary responses to the problem of evil is the issue of human freedom. And there are three big areas you can think about the issue of freedom and how it relates to this problem. The first is the issue of omnipotence and freedom. We've discussed that extensively in the last video. Then we have the issue of omniscience, which is, again, God's knowledge and human freedom. And then finally, we have the issue of what we call aseity and God's freedom. Today, I want to focus a lot on this issue of omniscience and freedom. In other words, looking at this second premise, if God is all-knowing, then he ought to know how to stop evil. Now, before we go very far, let's lay out what the argument is and a couple of typical counter responses to this. Typically, this argument goes something like this. If God knows the future, then all future acts are set. That means they're not subject to change. And remember, freedom is typically understood as the ability to choose A or B. You have two roads you can choose between. But if all future acts are set, they're not subject to change, then I'm not free to choose other than what has already been set. And therefore, it seems to follow, obviously enough, that God's knowledge determines the future. And otherwise, it may look like that we have two choices, but in fact, we don't. We only really have one choice here. That would make the whole universe deterministic. Free will would be an illusion. There's one sense this is problematic in the sense of we want to say as Christians that we have free will. This is also another problem specifically for the problem of evil, because if God's knowledge somehow limits the future and what God knows is all the evil, then does this in some sense mean that God's knowledge causes evil, or that God knows this evil is inevitable? Does that limit his power? All those sorts of things. So there's a special aspect of this problem when it comes to the issue of evil. Now, because of this problem, how do we hold both God's omniscience and his free will? Because this comes up, there have been a lot of responses to this. One recent answer that is becoming more and more popular in the evangelical world, especially, this guy, I have the picture here, Greg Boyd. He is a pastor. He argues for a position called Open Theism, which just directly challenges the idea that God is omniscient in the traditional sense. The argument goes something like this: God is so wise and so intelligent that he knows all possible futures with absolute certainty, mathematical certainty, if you will. He knows that if I choose A, then B and C are possibilities. And if I choose then C, then D and E are possibilities. And he can work out every possibility and know exactly how to respond. So he does not, however, know what we will actually choose, except beyond the fact that he makes very, very probabilistic assumptions. He knows me so well. He knows what I almost certainly will choose, but he doesn't actually know what I'll choose. He simply has a perfect contingency plan for every possible view. In this view, God is the ultimate planner. And then, so it is true on Boyd's view that God knows the end from the beginning. He just doesn't necessarily know how we're going to get there. Now, the problem with this view, well, there are many deep theological problems with it, but the primary problem is, yes, I will grant it preserves freedom. Obviously, it preserves freedom because God doesn't know what I'm going to do, but it does seem to give up a real definition of omniscience. Again, omniscience being God actually knowing the future. Now, a more moderate, if you will, approach. This is William Lane Craig, and listen, I'm gonna disagree with his argument here. This doesn't mean I don't respect him a ton. He holds to a position called neo-Molinism. This is a very, very popular position, again, becoming increasingly popular among evangelicals in particular. This wants to say that no, God's omniscience is real. So the way he does it is that God knows all logical counterfactuals. So the same idea of if I choose A, then I'll choose B. So this sounds like Boyd so far. And he knows, again, all counterfactuals of counterfactuals. So if I were to choose B, then in that case, then C and D. So far, we're kind of on the same page. Let me briefly pause the video. I felt like in recording that I did not explain that very well. So let me simply offer this very succinctly. The idea in neo-Molinism is that not only does God know all actual realities, but he also knows all possible worlds, if you will, as well. He knows that for any given possibility, these are the related possibilities to those as well. He knows all possibilities and possibilities of those possibilities too. It's really nothing more complicated than that. However, then rather than simply say that God doesn't know what I'm going to choose, he knows all possible worlds that could exist. And then what God does is, in the act of creation, God chooses which of those worlds to, if you will, initialize, to create. So if you were to take all those possibilities and label them, this is world number one, this is world number two, this is world number three, in which I made this choice, I made this choice, I made that choice. God looks at all those possibilities, sees the outcome that he wants, and says, I'm going to choose world number 4,867,247. That's the one that I'm actually going to create. So this would certainly, again, preserve God's omniscience because he knows everything and he knows what actually is going to happen because he picked it. But perhaps the problem you can imagine with this, it is stronger than open theism in its defensive omniscience, but I think it probably risks preserving omniscience by giving up free will. You can say, and Craig certainly will say, no, in this world, you really made this choice, but it's not exactly as clear that I made this choice if God picked it because this is the one that I was going to make. It's not exactly obvious that I really did make this. Maybe God picked this for me, especially if all logical possibilities are considered. Basically, God is just picking the world while I act the way he wants me to. I think the better response is actually a very straightforward response. It is simply this: God knows exactly what I'm going to choose. And really, I think we need to let that sit. God knows what I will choose. And if God knows what I'm going to choose, the fact that he knows what I'm going to choose does not negate the fact that I'm the one who actually has made that particular choice, even if it's in the future. The issue here, and this is the underlying assumption everybody seems to get wrong, the issue here is not whether the future is set, but rather the question is whether or not the future is the result of my choice, or is the future the result of someone else's choice? If the future certainly is determined on the view I'm suggesting, but the question is it determined by me as the chooser, or is it determined by something or someone else? And to get a little philosophical here, I think what the traditional arguments do is they confuse what's an epistemological claim. An epistemological claim is how we know what we know, with an ontological claim, which is what things actually are. So the question of God knowing my future is an epistemological claim. How does God know my future, as opposed to the ontological claim of who made my choice for me? The next part, I think, will make that clearer if it's not. The question we need to ask is, what is determining any given effect, including, say, choices? So one possible answer is called indeterminism. There is nothing that's actually causing any particular effect. It's just random chance without causation. So take determinism, wipe it out completely. It's indeterminism. Now, let me say, I don't think this is a good position, because I think it's pretty absurd to say there's any such thing as an effect without a cause. That just strikes me as logically self-contradictory. All effects presume causes. So I think we can just logically rule out indeterminism. So we are going to be left with some sort of determinism. So then let's continue. Then there is what we might call, this is what we might call hard determinism. This is where the effects are determined by information processing or the laws of nature. My computer, when it's running programs, even randomly generating effects, this is an entirely deterministic process. The computer has absolutely no free will whatsoever. And so what happens is when nature is processing, it just A leads to B, B leads to C, C leads to D, and so on. Even in this view, free will is nothing more than my brain processing information. Well, what is that? That's just neurochemistry. What is that? That's just chemistry. That's just physics. And so that's just the interaction of quarks and atoms, if you will, entirely deterministic. So the problem here, of course, is so God could certainly perfectly calculate the future. Set aside, you theorists, issues of Heisenberg uncertainty principle. The fact is, this could allow for God's omniscience, but it certainly would not allow for anything like free will. Another possibility is that there actually is a faculty called the will, and that the will does make its own decisions. We might say the will is self-determined, and this is the traditional view we want to uphold. It's called libertarianism, as in I have the liberty to choose A or B. But in keeping with our language, I like the term agency-determinism. The idea here would be an indeterminism. There's no cause to the effect. In hard determinism, the effect is entirely externally caused, whereas in agency determinism, the will is its own agent and the will is the one that chooses. And so it's agency determination. And then finally, we might have a compatibilistic idea or a soft determinism where, yes, the will is involved in choosing, but the will is itself being determined by something else or someone else. So God makes the will choose this or that, or theological, the sin nature chooses this or that, or physically, if you will, the atoms in my brain makes the will choose this or that. So soft determinism, in my view, really just reduces into some particular form of hard determinism with the idea that, yeah, we have some sort of free will. I don't find that very compelling. I think the proper view of this is agent determinism, where my will is a real agent and actually chooses what it's going to do. So then what's the bottom line on this? It's that if humans were free, would that limit God's knowledge? And the answer is no, because God's knowledge of my choices does not mean that I did not have the freedom to choose other than what I did. What we have to do is distinguish between hard determinism, soft determinism, agency determinism, and indeterminism. If we want to claim that God's knowledge somehow determines the future, you have to actually make the claim, an ontological, not an epistemological claim, that God's knowledge forces me to choose one of the other things. In fact, we need to simply say, and all that we have to say is that the issue is not whether the future is open. The future is when it comes to choosing A or when it comes to choosing B, that I am the one who makes that choice. And then God knows what that choice is, even if I'm not free to choose otherwise. Well, in fact, I was free to choose otherwise. Had I chosen the other, God simply would have known that instead. And thus, this does, in fact, allow for God's complete knowledge of all future events. Even it allows my free will, again, free will understood being the thing that determines choosing between A and B. The upshot to all this with respect to the problem of evil is it does allow God to fully know the future and to fully know all acts I'm going to do, including evil acts, with all the deficiencies and all the defects that presumes, as we talked about in previous videos. What this does leave unresolved is what we might call an issue of the contingency of the divine intellect on my own choices. That's what we're going to talk about in the next video. Until then, I encourage you, go ahead and leave your questions and your comments and your cries of outrage in the comments below. This is a big issue. This is a complicated issue. We've only discussed it very briefly, and we will say more later on. But until then, may God richly bless you.